Hi, everybody. Hey. So I'm super nervous. Public speaking is not my forte. So what I like to do is start with a joke. So does this work? Okay. So what do you call a polite American? A Canadian. All right. So my name is Stephan. So I'm French Canadian. I'm from Ottawa, Canada, and I've been living in the States for about 10 years now. And so I studied graphic design. I went to La Cité Collégiale in Ottawa. Woohoo, Ottawa, yay! And then soon after that, I actually went to 3D animation in video games at the NAD Center back in the 90s, late 90s. So that shows my age. I started my career working at Softimage. When XSI just came out, I was doing tech support for Softimage. And soon after that, I worked in production in Montreal. And after that, I went to work at Autodesk. I did tech support for about 5 years in combination with XSI. And so what I've learned from that, actually, is I learned how to have empathy. And this is before UX was actually a thing. And what I'm trying to say here is that empathy is basically one of the biggest skill sets you will have as a UX designer. Because what happens is that if you put the point of view of your emotions into, if you see the point of view of the user, it will make you a way better UX designer because you will see what their frustrations are, what they're like. They're on a TED deadline. They don't give a shit about like the fact that you know, they bought $10,000 worth of software. They want to get their solutions to their problems, right? So when you have empathy towards that, it makes you a better UX designer. So I actually worked also at some really cool studios. I worked at Ubisoft, Double Helix, Trine World, Activision, Wargaming, and I kind of took a break actually for a while, and I went to work at Accenture, of all places. And to be honest with you, it was actually a big challenge for me to get out of video games. I had to rebrand myself. And, but the great thing about Accenture is that I learned about data analytics, which is something that UX designers use every day. Soon after that, I actually went to work in VR. I worked on Werewolves Within. I worked on Archangel. Maria actually also worked at right there. We worked together on Werewolves Within. So that was pretty cool. But that was my first introduction in VR. And so now I work at Survios. And if you're not familiar with Survios, we actually did some pretty cool games. I did not do the UI for raw data. So if you played raw data, I did not do the UI. All right? But I did the UI for Sprint Vector, Electronauts, and Creed. Creed just came out yesterday. I'm very proud of my team because it's #1 on Steam right now. So hooray for that. So the great thing also with Survios is that we are building arcades throughout the US and Canada. And with the arcades, what's great, because a lot of people, the unfortunate thing with VR is that it's not made for the mass public yet, right? Meaning that it's really expensive. You need to have a computer. You need to have the headset. And basically, so what we're doing is that we're removing all that. And basically, people, it's like a Dazed and Busters. And if you just want to show your mom how to use VR, you bring your mom to the arcade. And then basically, you play. And with that, though, is that we actually collect a lot of data, which is really beneficial for us. So this is for us like a testing paradise. So we're still learning the market of VR because we don't really know. VR went through sorry, I'm looking for where they're at. Spike, a peak, and then it went down. So VR kind of slowing down a little bit, but we're learning from the market right now. So in UX and VR, there's actually no rules whatsoever. I mean, it's not like Apple or Google where they have like their own Google documents and their styles and stuff like that. Nobody has really taken ownership of that. But Survios is kind of trying to change that with our arcades. And also the different type of controllers. We have the Vive, we have the Steam. So we have different peripherals to basically to deal with VR. So another thing too with VR is that people get motion sickness. It's a real thing. So how do we resolve it? So we resolved it by doing a proprietary software here at Survios, which is called fluid locomotion. And I'm going to read from this because it basically just says, use arm swing motion mechanics in a whole new way, as a driver of the locomotion system has not just a mechanical gesture. So basically what it's trying to say is that so sprint vector is basically you're running. And you're having the controllers like this, and you're running. And the faster you move the controller, the faster you get into the world. It's a fun game, guys. If you have not played in VR, play Sprint Vector. It's a lot of fun. So soon after that, we integrated the speed and the distance of the arm swing motion and translate it into a momentum, pulling the player forwards within the VR world. So as you're going, like explaining, as you're going faster, the world is coming to you. And after that, doesn't trigger nausea due to the constant physical movement and repeated resynchronization and engagement with the VR environment. So I have a video, actually. So this is how, you undo it? So this is actually how you look when you're playing Sprint Vector. Oh, sorry. It's supposed to be a joke, but it's not really working. But there you go. It's kind of like, there you go. That's what you look like when you're playing Sprint Vector, right? So it's not for, yeah, it's kind of funny. But, all right. Okay. So different type of interactions in VR. So what we have is basically laser pointers, which is actually often used. And we also did, you can actually have 3D geometry. So this is actually something that I've done for Archangel, which is another VR game. So what I did for this is because my background, actually, I used to do 3D, so I'm also a 3D artist. I actually basically created the cube, like the bun in 3D. And the way that we perceive in this game is that the user actually has to put their hands into the bun, and then it gets a highlight state, right? Super not intuitive, just FYI. So not the best way of doing this. We learn from our mistakes, right? So another way is basically if you have like a Google cardboard or something, and basically you have a pointer, and when you click on a button, there's like a little timer that goes on it. So that's another type of interaction. And so for Sprint Vector, what I did is basically that we did a tablet, and the tablet was actually very similar to what a mobile device would have been, like an iPad or something. So essentially what we did is that we tried to mimic a familiarity to UX. Menus should be all modular, meaning that they should be all different components individually. And have really strong tutorials. So one thing that's really funny in Sprint Vector was the fact that people literally had to physically duck in VR. So when you had an object, since you're running, if you had an object that's coming towards you, you literally had to duck, right? But people were actually thinking that they needed to press a button, so which was not the case. You literally have to duck. Do not reinvent the wheel. Try using UX that are very familiar with the end user, like a grid system or mobile, like Sprint Vector, what we did. So at Survios, we actually have 4 pillars for production. One is research, pre-production, production, and then end cycle. So I'll go through all these. I'll try to do this as fast as I can, because I have a lot of slides. So the first one is research. So we have a kickoff meeting, introduction to the project on board. And soon after that, we collect mood boards, collect references, we do mind maps, and then fun exploration. And I will go through all of these individually. We also have a marketing team, and I put an asterisk on there because I'm very well aware that a lot of studios don't have a marketing team, but we do, and we have that luxury of that. Also, just keep in mind, production for VR is usually way smaller scale. For example, we could have 3 months or 6 months to do a whole game, whereas if you work on a AAA title, you'll have a couple years. So it's very different from for that point of view. So the first one is the kickoff meeting. So you touch base with all your project leads. You get the vision of the game. You start getting inspired. You want to do, like, we're thinking of arcade experience or a home. So basically, we'll cater to the people who just want an arcade, because you have different personas for the people who are arcade, and then you have different personas for people who just want an experience. And then you also have the home users, right? So they also have a different experience because they also could just be using an Oculus towards a PSVR. And then always do MVP for minimal viable product. So when you start off, you always want to start with the bare minimums. And then try recycling templates. So every game is going to have a screen calibration. Every game is going to have an option menu. So you just try to recycle. Work smarter, not harder. Collect mood boards. So one thing that I personally use is that I use Pinterest. Because Pinterest is a great way to collect mood boards, get inspired. And then I collect references. I use 2 tools for that. I use PureRef, and I also use Adobe Bridge. And this is what a mind map looks like. So basically what a mind map is that you kind of have to break down everything that you have. So if you have a HUD or if you have an option menu, for example, you kind of break down everything, and then you share this information with the game designers, the production, and you just kind of like go through all the steps, and then that's where it comes into modular. So you kind of break down everything into one component. Font exploration. So basically these are like different websites with different fonts. Asian character is a beast of its own, so I'm not going to touch that. But yeah, you always have to want to make sure that all your fonts supports eFigs. Marketing team. So in our marketing team, we deal with branding, we deal with visual language, logo icons. So we are very strong on social media. And so we do a lot of advertisements on Twitter, Instagram. And we try to do it all through our communication with social media because of our arcade. Most of our target audience are millennial, Gen Zs, and they're all for that. So in pre-production, we'll go with plan according scoping. So you always want to make sure that if there's any massive milestones that's coming up, like E3 or PAX, you want to make sure you take that in consideration. You basically have a game designer document feature with a minimal viable product. The UX designer, basically you have to start thinking of like the mind map, like as I was mentioning, and then you start breaking down things. And then you can also use InVision or Adobe XD for prototype. And then peer user testing. So, and I'll go through all these again. And UI engineer, implementation of basic shapes and UX. And we do visual artists. We do the style guide. And then we do the visual language as well. And then we have fonts and colors. And then obviously tutorial cards. So plan accordingly. If you're going to be using like another team member, like a modeler or an effects artist, you have to make sure you're bringing this up to your producer, and we make sure that we cater to their time, and everything is planned out. At Survios, we use Jira, but I know other studios use Handsoft or Microsoft Planner, whatever works for you guys, So the game designer document explains what the feature is. So the UI team should be receiving a game design document highlighting what is the need from the UI team. And then once the documentation is ready to review with the UI team, a kickoff meeting should be set up and producer of the game designer. Once the need is understood by the UI team, the team for each task and for each cycle can be produced in Jira. So now we're going to the UX designer, basic UX modular, based in mind map. So basically from the mind map, you will try to do everything modular. By reviewing the mind map, understand some basic features. So start thinking of the flow, if this is going to be a 3D interface, like it could be a website interface, mobile app interface. We don't know, depending on the game or personas, we don't know. But understanding the flow, and the UX designers start building wireframes in Flow in Illustrator or in InVision. And then from the mind map schematic, the UI team can start building the flows from some menus. So peer user testing. So as I mentioned, I prefer these 2 tools. I use InVision and also Adobe XD, which is awesome. They all have their pros and cons. But for me, I use the right software for the right product, So cloud-based is actually because everything is on the cloud. So you have InVision and Adobe XD. So it's really good to collect all the data, because what I do is that when I have a wireframe, I send it out to my whole team. And then what's great about InVision is that I have a lot of people who they just want to give feedback, and there's a way you can actually comment in InVision, which is really easy to do and really easy to understand. Because most people, you have to understand that the rest of my team, they don't know what InVision or XD is, and so they might be a little bit overwhelmed on how things are done, right? But keep it simple. So the UI engineer could also start being implementation, like just by using gray boxes. So they don't, if they have the flow of of Envision, they will know the flow, and they can just literally just do gray boxes and start implementing the logic behind it too. So gray boxes, and then just do your blueprints magic. So the visual style guide, so what I've done here basically is that I have all the different states for each of the different buttons, and this was for Sprint Vector. We have a toggle button, we have the main focus buttons there, but I kind of show all the different iterations for the different states. This is just not one thing you do once and that's it, right? This is an ongoing thing. It's like a living organism. It's like from the start to the end of the project, this gets updated on a constant basis. So I'm a visual artist. So we're going to have I think a couple of slides that I just say art tips. What these are for, basically, is that I've seen a lot of games, like God of War, where basically it's really hard to see a reticle if you're looking on a white background. So one thing that I do as a UI designer is that I always make sure that I have a white background, a gray background, and a black background for everything that's related to the HUD. Because the last thing you want to do is look for that tiny little reticle if you're in a snowstorm level or something and the reticle is white. So frustrating. So hey, fonts cost money, people. Like, you'd be surprised how many times they go to a producer and they're like, what, $5,000 for a font? I'm like, yeah, it's an artist who did it. Like, artists should get paid, right? So they cost money, and people don't know this. It's mind-blowing, but whatever. But the good thing is that in Unreal, there's actually a really good font that's Roboto, and it's actually free. It's made by Google, and you can use that, and it supports localization, which is awesome. Copyrights and licensing are so complicated. My eyes go back in my head. I'm just like, oh, I have to deal with this. It's like talking to lawyers. You just don't want to deal with that, right? But they are complicated. However, there is a way we can go about doing this, is that if you actually create your own font. And this is actually something that we did at Survios. For 3 projects, actually, we actually did our custom font. And I will show you how I've done this. So I went on this website. It's called Prototypo.io, and this is a great website. It basically has all these different sliders, and you can customize your font. And once you export this font, what happens is that you can use a software like FontLab and Adobe Illustrator, and you bring all your glyphs. Now, glyphs are just letters. You bring your glyphs from FontLab into Illustrator. So for example, if you're missing a glyph in Spanish or in French, you can go ahead and create an Illustrator, and then you can export it. You literally copy and paste it back into FontLab, which is great. So this is the font that we did. It's called Iron Horse, and we did a family. We did a regular, bold, italic. And those are basically all the glyphs that we needed for English. So for now, since we're doing arcades, we don't care much for localization for now. But if I were to be working at a AAA studio, I would have to have a lot more glyphs than this. And then, so as I mentioned, we actually had 3 projects using this font. And then what's happening is that you save money. So show me that money. Because you're saving that money for the studio, right? So it's really important. There's also, I just found this out last week, so there was a Kickstarter. It's called Font Self. And Font Self, what it does is that for this price, sorry, it's kind of like a publicity here, but yeah, it looks really cool. I personally never tried it as of yet, but feel free to try it if you need to create your own font. This is actually a lot cheaper, and it looks pretty cool. If you know how to use Illustrator, you should be able to use how to create your own font. So visual colors, right? So Adobe has a great tools to also use a good way of managing colors, what colors goes well with what. And then you start brainstorming also with the marketing team, right? Like, we have conversation on a regular basis with our marketing team due to the fact that how they're going to be branding our video game actually on the website has a massive impact on the UI. So we want to make sure that tutorial codes, right? So as I said, video tutorials are really cheap and easy to do. 80% of the people that are going to our arcades are actually first-time players. So they're very unfamiliar with how to use a Vive controller or something like that, right? So VR is not really for, I mean, it is for gamers, but when you go to the arcade, you have a different set of people. It's kind of mind-blowing, actually. But the most important thing is make it fun, make it intuitive, and make it easy. So just like me, no. Sorry, that was a bad joke. So, production, right? So production kickoff meeting, again, per feature this time. You have the game designer, you present the design document, and then you basically reskin your wireframes, additional to the visual style of version 2, and then you do some motion page transition if needed to, and then you do any 3D for UI, mock-ups for in prototype again, spec sheets, UI engineers, blueprints in UMG, concept layouts, visual artists, reskin programmer art, user testing. So this is actually a UX of a UX. So this is actually, I bring this to every studio I go for because it's really good way of doing things. So once you get the design document from the game designer, you basically send it out to the right people. So you send it out to the producers, and then it gets broken down into three sections, I would say. So you got the UX, and then you got the art, and you got the engineer. And depending on the task, or depending on what your role, you will follow the proper flow of this, right? So reskinning mockups, so this is an example for Sprint Vector. So on my left is actually the wireframe, and on the right is actually visual artist. So like a reskin of everything. Another art tip is that I use Illustrator just for shapes. For me, Illustrator equals shapes. I can't really explain it, but I build everything like my shapes in Illustrator, then I bring them into Photoshop, and I use layer styles. Layer style is my jam. It's like, it's so easy to use, and not only that, is that you can actually put them onto your Creative Cloud, and you basically just set your own visual style in your Creative Cloud, because if you have a set of like layer style that the colors, the glow, super easy, click of a button, as simple as that. So another thing too that I do is that the way that I work is that I have a whole folder that's PSD. And then what I do is that this is basically non-destructive. So I keep everything that is essentially like, that's not rasterized. I will never rasterize anything into the PSD folders. But also I name that folder properly, where basically you have the version, you know the functionality of the button, and then you also know what the state of the button is. And what I do is that once I'm done with all my style, with my PSD folder, I literally drag it, and I make a copy, and I rename it as a TGA. We use Unreal, by the way, so I know that if you're in Unity, you could use PNGs, and that would also work for PNGs. But we're using TGAs, and then basically what I do is that I hit Control-E, which is basically rasterizes all my layers in Photoshop, and I select the element on the layer, and I save that as an alpha if there's transparency. And then I basically start exporting this. And at work, we actually have a script that I use, our tech artist. A shout out to my friend Izzy, because she was awesome. She basically created us a script that with a click of a button, I can produce all those assets within 30 seconds. But if I didn't have the script, it would take me like maybe like an hour worth of work, depending on how many assets. So, so for motion, I have a little video that I'd like to show you guys. So sometimes on some projects, basically, they want to show the page transition. So going from one page to another. And what I personally use is I use After Effects. And I want to show you guys an example of how this was done for Electronauts, which is another game in VR. So let's see if they can load it up. So I'm showing here like the highlight states. So basically the art director, the UI engineer, they know what to be expected, like what type of animation, right? For me to build this in Unreal would have taken, with the UI engineer, literally like 2-3 weeks of production, right? It would have taken me like 2-3 weeks. So it took me like a day in After Effects, right? But everybody's on the same page. Everybody knows where we're going, so which is awesome, right? All right, okay. So if you need to have any 3D meshes that needs to be done for the UI, so we have to take note of that. And then, so mock-up prototype. So basically, again, I would reskin all my UX, and then I would build another version in InVision or XD to basically show the new style of the game. Spec sheets. All right, so what are spec sheets? Spec sheets are basically, it gives you the dimensions of all the different components. So this is an example of Creed. And basically, I give this to my engineers because then they will know how to make things into UMG, which is awesome. So one little thing, any UI engineers here in the crowd today? No? Oh, man. We love you guys. I'm sorry. There you go. We love you guys. Like, you have to give love to your UI engineer people because you're only good as your art, but the UI engineer puts all your shit into the game. So you got to make sure that you have a good relationship with them. Because if you have a sour relationship, the game's going to suffer, right? Am I right? Super important. So shout out to all the UI engineers. So we use Unreal, as I mentioned. And then basically the UI engineer would put everything into Unreal. And then we do some concept layouts. So these are different examples that I've done, different styles. Try exploring that. There's always iterations, always changes. If the programmer actually puts some gray boxes, you have to make sure that you go back into the UMG. We basically change it with the art. And then you do user testing. So you can do user testing at any point. If you're using Adobe XD, you send out the link. People give you feedback. And then we also go to the arcade, as I mentioned, and we collect data from there. So the end cycle, so if you purchase any fonts, you have to make sure that the font is purchased. And then all the text strings are they're localized. We collect the credits. Marketing team adds this for marketing. And localization for eFigs. And we do postmortems. So for fonts, we just want to make sure that you group your fonts into, because what happens in Unreal is that if you have multiple different set of sizes of fonts, it actually is a performance issue. Well, it's not a big performance issue, but just be mindful of like, if you can have like a header and your header is like 20 points, make sure you're consistent with that 20 points because the more size of fonts you have, the more memory it can take. So text strings, I personally don't deal with this, but this is actually a coworker of mine, Rex, who's a fantastic UI engineer. And basically, this is what he says when you're dealing with the text string. So basically, everything is from a PO file, gets into an Excel, and then it gets into Unreal. I don't know how he does it, but he does it. So I like to look at pretty graphics. So credits, basically, we collect all the credits from everybody who worked on the team. And then, so marketing, sometimes like if we use icons, for example, this is actually some icons that we did for Sprint Vector. And then they needed this basically for their website. So I make sure I touch base with them and I say, hey, do you guys need anything from me or from us? And if they say yes or no, and then we just give them to that. And then localization, it's always a beast, as I mentioned. You gotta deal with that. And then we do postmortems, and postmortem we say what we did right, what we did wrong, and what we can improve. Super important. We learn from our mistakes, right? And then, or our failures. So a little shout out here. So I live in LA. So next month, I'll be teaching a UI design class at Noman. So if you guys are interested in this, I can guarantee you it's going to be a lot of fun. So just a little plug there, and that's pretty much it. So that's it. Thank you, guys. So any questions? Don't be shy. Hey.
Hi. I have a question about accessibility design in VR. Do you have any part of that? Is that part of your process? How do you test for that? Thinking about contrast and other parts of accessibility.
Accessibility, when you mean accessibility, you mean you're talking about what exactly?
Thinking about like color contrast, so visual impairments, audio impairments, all the different aspects of it. In VR.
I mean, the thing is with VR, I'll be honest, is that it's such a niche market that sometimes when I worked in video games, basically like on AAA studios, we take in consideration colorblind people, for example, right? We take in consideration people who may not, they might have a disability or something, right? We take that in consideration. In VR, since we only have 3 to 5 months of production, unfortunately, like I said, it's such a niche market that we don't really take that into consideration. It's really unfortunate. So I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but like when I talk about accessibility, like when I think of colors, we do testings. For example, if the font bleeds, for example, if you're using a text that has a very bright color, a lot of saturation, the font actually could bleed from it. So if you're holding something that's really up close to you, that color could actually bleed a little bit. So what I go about doing that is that I put a stroke around the font. So my rule of thumb is that I usually put a 2-pixel stroke at about 50% opacity, and it's black. Okay. So that kind of helps out because it kind of breaks the bleeding of the color of the font, because like you can deal also with the fact that you'll have an interface that's so far away from this, and then you move it up front. So legibility is going to be a massive factor, right? So for example, I usually stay away from serif fonts because since they have that little, the little serif at the very bottom, what happens is that it's kind of hard to read the fonts, like because they all touch each other, right? Okay. So it's better to use something that's non-serif, in my opinion. And then, so yeah. So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
No, that's great.
That's
Thanks
great?
so much.
All right, no worries. Hey.
Hi.
Hey.
You mentioned conducting user testing in the arcade or collecting data. Could you speak more about that?
Sure. So basically, so we are collecting a lot of data. We are getting, instead of using personas, we're actually collecting that data from the arcades. I can't really share that information because I'm not sure if that's public or not. But for example, we were working on this game for a while, and we basically decided to go with an arcade version of the game, right? But at first, when we were bidding like games like Raw Data, Sprint Vector, Electronauts, the UX was actually fairly complicated because we thought that's what the market wanted, right? So, but when we started doing our arcade testing, we soon realized that, oh my God, this is so wrong. Because like, for example, like people get lost very easily. First of all, you got like a minute before they're like, oh my God, they put a headset on and they're like, oh, VR is so friggin' cool, man. It's like, so, and then they're blown away by that, right? Once that magic goes away a little bit and they're like, okay, so what do I do now? Like things are not intuitive for them. And then they have a peripheral in their hands. They don't know, like the Oculus has 2 buttons. They don't want to take their headset off and look at the buttons, right? So you got to keep it simple with the arcade people. So we use Vives at the arcade. With the Vive only has 1 controller, but this is why games like Beat Sabers are doing so well, because all you have to do in Beat Sabers is that you have these cubes that are coming at you and you slice them, and it's super fun, but it's super easy, right? So we kind of like have to like think of like when we go to the arcade, we have to dumb it down. I know this sounds bad, but it's like, because you have such a spectrum of different type of people that you have to cater to all of them. And you'll have your mom, you'll have your grandmother, you'll have like whoever, right? And, but mostly it's the younger generation. And they might not be playing like a lot of games, you know? So, but they would definitely want to try VR. So we collect that data by asking them questions. And this is why that panel before us, before me, was actually really informative for me, because asking the right questions is super crucial. So, did that answer your question? All right, awesome. Hey. Oh, I'm sorry.
And we have time just for one more question, so
Okay,
go ahead.
cool.
Yeah.
Cool. I'm so happy though, because I was sure I was going over the limit, but I'm glad that I was just, all right, cool.
You mentioned a little bit about VR sickness being less of an issue due to the physicality.
Right.
Can you describe a little bit of the process of kind of how you figured out how to best
Yep.
counter that for your game?
So we were actually working on another game so that you do have to walk a lot. And so one thing that we've noticed is that having a tunnel vision, sometimes when you're, the moment that you start walking, if you have a tunnel vision, it actually slows down a little bit, like the motion sickness. But what we did for Sprint Vector, as I was mentioning, is it's all about the momentum of how fast you're swinging the arms. And as soon as like people are getting like excited and they're like pumping, you know, they feel the emotion. So they don't really consider of being motion sickness because they want to go faster, right? So by doing that, we also have like, as you're going faster, we have a tunnel vision, but it's actually like lightning rods that gives you that impression of like you're being the Flash, you know what I mean? It's like, so you're running, and then, but it kind of narrows down and we're blurring the sides as well, which just kind of helps out the motion sickness. So, all right, that's it. All right, well, thank you so much, guys. I appreciate it.